Hello everybody, and either welcome or welcome back to my podcast. As always, if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. So, as I'm sure you have already figured out from looking at the title of this episode, this is an episode that I wanted to make and kind of sit down and try to do something in the hopes that maybe everybody can walk away from this a little more educated than they were before they listened to it. I mean, that's always my hope on every episode, but especially this episode. And that is on the things that I kind of see every time I talk about immigration online and anytime I see anybody else talk about it. And that is some of the misconceptions that are surrounding immigration and the asylum process. Now, before we get into this episode, I kind of want to explain what this episode is about and what it is not about. Now, this episode concerns itself with the actual immigration/asylum process, which those are two kind of different things. They're kind of the same thing. It's all very, very complicated in the United States as far as our immigration system. It's a hot mess, but this is about that particular system. This is not about what immigrants do or do not do once they get here. That can be a whole nother episode in and of itself. But I wanted to make this episode to try to address some of the things that I see said every time immigration is brought up that are either misinformed or are just outright lies, or are just things that happen when people don't entirely understand a topic that they're opining on. And to that note, on the idea of when people kind of opine on the topic of immigration and on the asylum process, I am of two minds on this, because there are people who do say things, believe in things, latch on to certain things in bad faith because it furthers their preferred narrative and the thing that they would like to believe. But I do think there are also people who parrot things and aren't necessarily doing it in bad faith, but it's just immigration is one of those topics that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to understand the process. And a lot of that is because our immigration system is completely fucked. But it's also difficult to understand if you are somebody who isn't interested in this and isn't kind of passionate about it and doesn't, do the research and do the legwork and read up on it and read up on the history of it, and you're just relying on contemporaneous reports on it. It's very hard to find anybody who doesn't demagogue this issue and just reports on it straight. So I can't say that everybody who says certain things that are incorrect or not entirely correct is doing it completely out of bad faith, because it's a very hard thing to try to understand and wrap your head around. And when you have so many people who want to talk about a particular topic like this, and they want to do it from a particular slant, it's hard to know what the truth is. So I wanted to make this episode to try to help you guys. And for what it's worth, this episode is not me giving my opinions on things. These are facts that I will be distributing to you. And of course, probably at some point my opinion will come up because it's me. And if you're new here, if you've somehow magically stumbled upon this episode somehow, hi, my name is Jen, and I am very pro Ellis Island style immigration. So that's probably going to bleed through. But like I said, I wanted to try to factually discuss this topic so that maybe going forward, everybody that listens to this can have something of a baseline of understanding exactly what this process is, what it entails, what's going on, and then maybe you can be more educated, even just discussing it. I mean, not even that you have to change your mind about how you feel about immigration, but just to kind of know what it is that we're dealing with. So let me go ahead and stop rambling and I would also like to go ahead and apologize. This is probably going to be a long ass episode because there's a lot to discuss, even with the parameters that I've put on this episode. There's a lot to discuss, which again lends itself to the idea that this is a very hard topic for people who don't make it a point to kind of study and follow this, to really kind of grok and understand like what it is that's going on. So let's go ahead and kind of get into it. So I want to start with the thing that is my genuine, honest to God, pet peeve every time I or anybody else talks about immigration in any kind of public forum, and that is the concept of doing it legally. And also the concept of illegal immigration and who is and is not an illegal immigrant. So, kind of backing up to give you a little bit of history of how the U.S. has handled immigration. Up until 1965, we had an immigration policy, kind of, sort of. We'll get to that in a little while. But it was mainly not entirely open borders. I mean, there was a point, obviously, in the U.S. where we were open borders, clearly. But there has been less restrictions put on in previous eras, and the criteria for, quote-unquote, doing it legally and being able to become a naturalized citizen, to become a full U.S. citizen, to even just make it onto the mainland, was way, 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 way more lax back in the day. And everybody brings up Ellis Island, and like I said, that is my preferred immigration method. But when the golden era of immigration was happening in the United States, it was very much this thing where you came here on a boat, because the airplanes weren't really a thing back then. So you came here on a boat, and you went through a processing center. Ellis Island is one of them. There's one in Boston. There are ones out in California. And basically what it was is you showed up, you gave them your information, they gave you kind of like a rudimentary sort of physical health checkup, did a criminal background check as much as one could do a criminal background check back then. I mean, and we're also talking like anywhere between like 1890 to the late 1920s, so it's not like they had computer databases or anything. So you go through that, and if you pass all that, then congratulations, welcome to America. God help you. Vaya con Dios. Make a life for yourself. And how things were kind of handled back then was obviously, and this is another point that everybody brings up, and I will give you this, and that is that this all happened before our current welfare state existed. Okay, set that aside for a second. Because the way things were handled back then are a way that things kind of are and could be better handled now. Is that, okay, say somebody came to Ellis Island and they had family here. Well, what would be expected would be that either your family or some other outside agency would vouch for you and basically say like, okay, we are taking this person into our care. We are going to be responsible for taking care of this person so that they're not like destitute on the street and homeless and basically just sucking up resources. That's how that was handled. And it's also a reason why you still see, especially in New York and to an extent in Boston too, you kind of still have those like racially segregated neighborhoods. Like you had like Little Italy and Little China, and that used to be like Irish neighborhoods were a thing too. But that's why that existed, is because you had this community that basically vouched for you, accepted you, took care of you so that you wouldn't be a burden on anybody else. And that's generally just how things were handled back in the day, which makes a lot of sense. But starting back in 1965, that's when we started to really have like a serious immigration system, as far as really starting to be much more strict with visas and really codifying the immigration process. Before then, it was kind of just, a little more nebulous, a little more free-for-all for some people, not for all people, but for some people, for most people. But there were some very notable exclusions back then. Now, bringing it back to present day, for those immigrants that are coming from the Northern Triangle, and when I say the Northern Triangle, I'm talking about Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. For those people, and like I said, our immigration system is the most bizarre, crazy thing of life. But to kind of simplify it for the sake of not getting too far into the weeds on this, for that group of people, the asylum process is really the only way they have of doing it legally. And let me try to explain that. There are different ways that one can come to this country legally. You can apply for asylum, obviously. You can apply for refugee status, and that is a very specific sort of designation that is over and beyond asylum status, and it is more difficult to get. You don't have to be from particular countries, but it is typically reserved for people from different countries specifically. That it's like the most easy common day example that I can give is Cuban refugees, people who are fleeing like a communist country, or people who are fleeing government violence or government tyranny, kind of things like that. That would get you refugee status. Now, we don't recognize the situation in the Northern Triangle as being as such like people in Cuba. Like, obviously Cuba is a communist country, so we extend refugee status to people fleeing from communist countries. So we don't look at the Northern Triangle countries in that same way, which is a thing that I will leave off on because I have my opinions on that, but that's not what this is about. So, when you're trying to enter the United States legally, like I said, you got three options. You've got asylum, you've got refugee status, and you've got visas. Now, visas are a very interesting topic right now, and it's something that a lot of people don't talk about because obviously the whole border situation plays better and more well on television and gets more clicks and likes and more clout. Okay, whatever. Here is where we kind of get down to how we currently deal with quote-unquote legal immigration. So, you've got two different kinds of visas that you can get. And when I say that, I'm breaking it down into two different categories. As far as non-immigrant visas, and you have immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas, the categories for non-immigrant visas are nuts. Like, the breakdown is so granular, it's like, I'm just like, what? But the basic categories are, like I said, immigrant and non-immigrant. And this kind of, the names of them kind of give away what the different purposes of the visas are. Obviously, non-immigrant visas are for people who are not planning to move to the U.S. permanently, and immigrant visas are for people who are planning to move to the U.S. permanently. Now, non-immigrant visas, you've got everything from your low-skilled temporary seasonal workers all the way up to, like, skilled workers, people who are here to study, people who are here to work in specific jobs, people who are here for diplomatic purposes. Basically, there's a lot of different non-immigrant visas one can get. Immigrant visas, however, are very, 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 very now strictly defined, and the numbers that are available seem to be dwindling by the year. But basically, to get an immigrant visa, there are a lot of hoops to jump through, and you have to basically, it is entirely merit-based. Like, you cannot just apply for an immigrant visa and just be like some schmo. Like, you have to be somebody who, in the parlance of how they put it, can provide value to our society. Basically, you either have to be like really fucking good at what you do, or you have to be somebody who's built a business or is planning on building a business that's going to make a lot of money, or you just have to be just like an insanely, astoundingly amazing person to get an immigrant visa. Now, non-immigrant work visas, on the other hand, have their own particular hurdles. And there is a broad range of non-immigrant work visas that one can qualify for. But the thing is, for non-immigrant work visas, the number one criteria is that you have to have an employer sponsor you in that work visa. So it's not like an immigrant can just take it upon themselves to apply for a non-immigrant work visa all on their own and then come to the US and find work. Basically, it's predicated on the idea that there is already an employer waiting for you and they are sponsoring your visa, which costs them money. This is not a free process. None of this is a free process, by the way. It all costs money, and you need legal representation for pretty much all of it, unless you are doing a non-immigrant work-related visa, and then it's not really up to you anyway, so you have to have somebody sponsor you. Now, going back to the Northern Triangle people, what they would qualify for, if they could qualify for a work visa, would be probably a low-skilled, temporary, seasonal immigrant visa. Most employers are not going to go all the way down to the Northern Triangle to find these people and then sponsor them to come into the U.S. to do low-skilled, temporary, seasonal labor. Like, when I said that, I mean like farm work, seasonal manufacturing work, stuff like that. That was typically how a lot of people from Mexico ended up with work visas. But going all the way to the Northern Triangle to find workers is obviously not something like an employer is really going to do. So the visa door for these people is pretty much shut. Like, you can't really go through it that way. The other kind of visa that is available is a lottery visa. And let me try to explain the diversity lottery, because I think a lot of people don't really understand how this works, including the President of the United States. Basically, how the diversity lottery visa works is they look at the makeup of the United States and the amount of immigrants that are in the United States. And the diversity lottery visas, sorry, I can't even talk anymore, are more weighted towards countries that they feel are underrepresented in U.S. society. And if you've ever looked at which countries get more or less lottery visas, yeah, it becomes a little obvious where they're going with that. And let's just say the Northern Triangle doesn't qualify for diversity lottery visas. Why can I not say that word right now? Anyway, so without getting too crazy about how the diversity lottery works, it's not something that is open to these people either. So essentially, the asylum process is their only legal option for trying to immigrate to the United States. So when people say that they are abusing the asylum process, my answer to that is there is no other process for them. Like, that's it. There's nothing else available to them. So what else would you like them to do? Like, that's it. And I understand. I understand a lot of people don't know what I know and haven't, like, gone into this the way I've gone into this. Okay, but now you know. It's not abusing a process. It's using the only legal recourse you have available to you as a person when you are trying to come here from the Northern Triangle to try to immigrate to the United States. I mean, this is it. It's the asylum process or just straight up illegally hopping the border. So, before we leave off on this particular topic, and this is something that I want to point out because I think a lot of people think that this particular situation, and when I say this particular situation, I'm not necessarily just talking about the border situation and the way people talk about it, but just immigration in general in this country. And this is something that a lot of people don't really like to know about or discuss or talk about, but there has been, throughout our immigration history, at least going back the past 120 years, there's been a lot of racism in our immigration system, and it's there. It needs to be discussed. And even going back to the Ellis Island days, and if you know anything about immigration history, you know that a lot of the things that are said about people coming up through the border today are the same exact things that were said about people coming from certain sections of Europe back in those days. It's almost verbatim. They're poor, they're dirty, they're low IQ, they're disease carriers, they're going to be a drain on society. It's the same shit over and over and over again, and it's another thing that annoys the hell out of me every time I see it, because again, I try to take a step back and realize that not everybody knows what I know, but when you know something about immigration history and you see these same arguments trotted out against these people that are coming up through the border and from other places around the world too, like let's not just limit it to there, let's keep it real. People coming in from the Middle East, from India, also get the same shit too. And knowing and understanding that this is the same thing that was said about Irish people and Italian people and Greek people and Polish people and Eastern European people and also the Jews, which let's go ahead and just unpack that for a second too. Our immigration policy, even up until like right after World War II, was pretty explicitly anti-Semitic. Like the Jews weren't really like allowed in the United States. Obviously they got here, but this also brings up the topic that a lot of people don't like to talk about, and that is kind of the history. And a lot of people, if you've gone through your family tree, you might have found this at some point in your family tree, but the idea that people immigrating to the United States back in even in the golden age of immigration, did kind of change their last names a bit sometimes, maybe even their first names, to seem to be more Western European, shall we say, in order to kind of circumvent our nation's rules about immigration. And the thing with Jews was kind of a soft cap. Where there was a hard cap was against people from Asia. Like Chinese people, Japanese people. It was literally legally illegal for Asian people to come into this country. Back even into like the 1930s and 1940s. It was dead ass illegal. Like there were laws against it. And that's nuts. Like our immigration system has had a racism problem for a very long time. And when people try to kind of parse it as a just right now issue, it's like, no, this is borrowing a certain strand of anti-immigration thought that has existed for over a century in this country. And now it's just being applied to this group of people versus that other group of people or that other group of people. And it's ugly and it's nasty, and I could probably do a whole episode on that too, but moving on from that to my next personal bugaboo that I always see get brought up at some point in my mentions every time I talk about immigration online, and that is the amount of asylum seekers who actually show up for their asylum hearings. Okay, collect yourself. The Trump administration and their various mouthpieces have put out into the universe that 90% of asylum seekers do not show up for their hearings. That is patently, blatantly fucking false. It is actually the opposite. And depending on whose numbers you use, you're looking at roughly 90% of people actually showing up to their asylum hearings. And I want to go ahead and give the breakdown here. And these numbers that I'm giving are not from some super duper happy-go-lucky, fruity, pro-immigration group. These are the numbers from both the Department of Justice and from TRAC. And TRAC is Syracuse University's Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, which is pretty much considered the gold standard of, like, neutral reporting on numbers based around these sorts of things with asylum seekers and how many people show up to court, how many don't. So, I want to go ahead and give actual numbers about who does and does not show up, and under what circumstances they do and do not show up. So, 92% of individuals who filed asylum claims attended their court hearings between fiscal years 2013 and 2017. In fiscal year 2018, 89.4% of those who applied for asylum complied with their court hearings. Now, that's obviously the opposite of 90% of people not showing up for their court hearings, which makes sense because if it is your aim and you go into the asylum system, okay, you make yourself known to the U.S. government, and say at some point you do want to apply for a green card, or you do want to become a full U.S. citizen, this is the starting point for that process. Like, first of all, you have to claim for asylum, you have to get asylum, and then after a year you can apply for your green card, and then I believe it's after 5 years you can apply for citizenship. So this is the starting point. So if you don't do this, you can't do any of that. So obviously, if that's your aim, or even if you just want to not live illegally in the country and just have at least some kind of peace of mind that you can kind of go about your business in life and not have to worry about looking over your shoulder, then yeah, you comply. So, moving on. Asylum seekers released from detention to pursue their claims attend immigration courts nearly 100% of the time. Government figures made available through the Syracuse University's Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse Asylum Decision Tracking Tool show near 100% appearance rates for asylum seekers released from immigration detention. Out of 10,427 decisions in fiscal year 2018 for released asylum seekers, only 160 received removal orders because they missed a court hearing, resulting in a 98.5% court hearing compliance rate. So again, to go to this whole situation of these border camps, and again, I'm going to not try to go into certain things in this episode because it's kind of beyond the purview of what I want this episode to be about. But you do not need to house people in insane conditions to make sure that they comply with their legal obligations. These are people, again, who wish to comply with their legal obligations. So they do, provided that they have the information that they need to do it. 98% of mothers with children who are represented by legal counsel comply with court hearing obligations. Again, these are us. If you're a mother and you have a child, then you definitely have a reason to comply, because obviously we see what happens when you don't. In a 15-year study, 92% of asylum-seeking families who were released from immigration detention attended all immigration court hearings. 92% of asylum-seeking families who were released from immigration detention attended all immigration court hearings. Why are we putting people in cages? Moving on. 98.8% of children with legal counsel showed up for their court hearings in 2018. The rate of missed hearings for individuals who passed a credible fear interview has dropped nearly 25% since 2012. In absentia rates often reflect overlooked needs of asylum seekers. Now, let me talk to you about in absentia. And this is something that's kind of getting... There's some abuse going on here, I do think, in some courts. But basically, what happens if you do not show up for your hearings? You can be ordered deported in absentia, which means that you didn't show up, so deportation orders were ordered against you. But here's the thing, and here's the flip side to that. If you are here and you don't have a lawyer, or you don't have somebody who is instructing you on how this process works, then your chances of missing a court date do go up because you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing. So there is that, and it's not that all of these people are just trying to like skip the system and just go live illegal. It's like sometimes if you don't have somebody telling you what you're supposed to be doing, then you don't know what the hell you're supposed to be doing. So yeah, that is the other one that is my other personal bugaboo, and that is because it's just saying that 90% of people who apply for asylum don't show up for their hearings is a point blank lie. And this is one that I will argue with people about online because this is a stat that needs to be refuted. It's one that keeps being put out there, and it is one that, like I said at the beginning of this, it's one of those stats that people like to latch onto because it justifies their particular narrative, even though it is a fucking lie. And you can tell people it's a lie, and they will argue with you about it, but it's a lie. No. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so next topic that hasn't been very hotly discussed lately because everybody is talking about asylum right now, but I'm so old, I can remember when chain migration was the hot, buzzy thing. Now, chain migration, or as some of us like to call it, family migration, is a certain subset of the immigrant visa system. And this is part of the immigrant visa system versus the non-immigrant visa situation. So, here's how it works. Say you are an immigrant and you get your legal status. You can apply for other people to also have visas, permanent immigrant visas, under very, very specific circumstances. And yes, these visas are capped. And I don't think I made the point when I was talking about visas earlier. All of these things are extremely capped. They are not unlimited. There is a definite cap year over year, and these caps are shrinking. So, to put that in perspective. So, again, say that you are here and you get your legal status, but your spouse is back in your country of origin. Now, you can apply for a visa to bring your spouse. You can apply to bring your parents. You can apply to bring your child, so long as they are under the age of 21. If they are over the age of 21, they have to navigate the system on their own. They are not eligible for a family visa. And that's it. That's it. Those are the only people eligible. It is not some goddamn free-for-all where if you get here legally, you can apply for your sister's second cousin twice removed to get here on an immigrant visa. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And even the people who do qualify to you, which is obviously immediate blood kin or your legal kin, or you can also do this for a fiance that you are saying, basically, if you've ever watched 90 Day Fiance, you know how this works, and I am so ashamed to admit that I've watched 90 Day Fiance, but basically you can also apply for a immigrant visa if you are engaged to somebody and you plan on getting married within the next 90 days. So, that's it. Those are the visas that you can apply for, and that's it. And it's always... people try to portray it as this kind of wild, crazy thing. And I'm sure everybody has seen the charts of how this can go crazy, wild, nuts, and you bring fucking like 200 people here. Let me try to explain something to you. To do that, you're looking at over 100 years. Like literally, if you like map out the time frame of some of these infographics of like, if you start and you get immigrant visas for these people and they get immigrant visas for their people and go on up, 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 you're looking at between 100 to 150 years. It's not something that's going to happen in like 6 months. Like chain migration and people being pissed off about it, it's just like the dumbest thing ever, because it's like, first of all, you don't understand how the visa process works. Second of all, and this is more of an overall point, is that chain migration / family migration is actually the way that people used to do this, because it was considered the most logical way of handling the situation. Like, immigrants who came here back in the turn of the century, it wasn't uncommon for 1 or 2 people from the family to come to the United States and then establish a household, you know, get a job, start making money, you're sending money back to your family back home. And then once you get to a point where you know that you can support those people, then you bring them over. You don't bring everybody over at once, because that's nuts. Like, why would you do that? So the whole idea of family migration being like this insane, like, oh my God, nobody's ever done this before. It's like, no, that's how everybody used to do it. If you were doing it in like a logical fashion and you weren't doing it to like escape a certain situation or something like that, that's a completely different thing. But yeah, if you were just immigrating to the United States, then that just makes sense. Like, why would you bring your whole family if you're not entirely sure what your living situation is going to be? Like, right? Like, that makes sense. So, anyway, moving on from that to the asylum process, bringing you back to modern day here. Here's the thing. I think a lot of people kind of don't really understand how this works. So let me try to explain it to you guys. It's not that you just show up and you show up to the border and you say, I'm claiming asylum, and whoosh, you have asylum. That's not how this works at all. So what happens is, okay, you get to the border, which, by the way, you have to be on U.S. soil to file for asylum. You cannot do it from anywhere else. Which, to go ahead and bring up this point, because I see this made a lot too, no, you cannot apply from a U.S. embassy in another country. While U.S. embassies are considered U.S. soil for certain situations, they are not considered U.S. soil for asylum situations, because, I mean, just sheer logistics. Like, okay, if you considered U.S. embassy asylum, a place where you can seek asylum, then once you file at that embassy, you would have to stay at the embassy. You can kind of see where logistically this is not going to work out, right? So, yes, you have to be on U.S. soil within the United States of America to apply for asylum. You cannot do it from anywhere else. So, drop that. Like, you have to be here. So, you get here. However you get here. You get here. You either enter through a port of entry, or you hop the border and turn yourself into CPB, and you say, I am here seeking asylum. Now, what happens then? You get entered into the asylum system. Step 1. You have a credible fear interview. Now, who conducts the credible fear interview right now is very fluid, shall we say. Normally it's supposed to be DHS, but now they've got CPB people doing it. I mean, it's just, I don't even know who the hell is supposed to be doing the credible fear interviews anymore, but you sit down, you do the credible fear interview. Based on that, and usually, or at least I've not seen numbers lately, especially since everything has kind of gone wackadoo with the asylum system, but usually, or at least it seems to be in most cases, you make it through your credible fear interview, you get entered into the asylum system. Now, next step is you wait for your court date to go to immigration court and to stand in front of a judge and make your case. Now, this is not a quick process. Right about now, the last numbers I've seen is between credible fear interview and actually getting in front of a judge, you're looking at least a year. At least. And a point I want to make. When you are in the asylum system, once you have gone through your credible fear interview, once you have been put into the system and you're waiting for your court date, you are here legally in the United States. You are not an illegal immigrant. Please stop calling these people illegal immigrants. Anybody who is in the asylum system and is waiting for their court date or waiting for their secondary court date or waiting for whatever court date they have to get a final decision, they are here legally. Not illegal. Legal. So no. Stop using that word. Just illegal immigrant, just it's like nails on a chalkboard for me. Especially when we're talking about this. But moving on, because we still have a lot to get through. And I know this is already long as hell, but like I said, this is a very hard topic to unpack. And I'm trying to give you guys as much information, even in like the small parameters that I already gave for this, as I possibly can. So, moving on to another misconception that I see a lot, and that is the safe third country thing. Now, understand, when we say that Mexico is not a safe third country, this is not us opining on Mexico. What a safe third country is it is a legally binding agreement between two countries that if somebody comes to country A, they have to apply for asylum in that country, and they cannot move forward out of that country and then they can't skip over that country, basically. And the U.S., does not have a safe third country agreement with Mexico. And Mexico has made it pretty damn clear that they are not interested in having one with us. Kind of off-topic fun fact, we do have one with Canada. So, if you come to the United States, you cannot apply for asylum in Canada. Just off the wall, fun fact. But yeah, I see a lot of people seeming to misunderstand the concept of what a safe third country is. And like I said, it's not an opinion on the country itself, which, I mean, there are more or less safe places in Mexico, and the places that people are being expected to stay were either insanely unsafe to begin with or are becoming unsafe because of corruption and cartels and the fact that there are people who will take advantage of people in gross and disgusting and awful, horrible ways, which again is not in the purview of this particular episode, and that's another one I could do a whole episode on. But yeah, understand that safe third country is an actual legal binding agreement. Now, I said all that. The U.S. is pursuing a safe third country agreement with Guatemala, which, first of all, what the actual fuck? Because Guatemala, as I pointed out, is part of the Northern Triangle, and is a country that people are fleeing because of cartel violence and government corruption and just general shitholeness. And the idea that you could even attempt to have some kind of safe third country agreement with a place that people are actively fleeing is nuts. It's absolutely freaking insane. But that's where we are. So, whether that's going to come to fruition or not, I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, this is a situation that just on a weekly basis, it seems, changes. But that is something that is on the table. It makes no fucking sense to anybody with half a brain, but that's where we're at. So, moving on to people who make it here, people who are in the asylum process. Here's the thing with working. And this is obviously, like, if you live someplace, you have to kind of make money somehow because you have to keep a roof over your head. You have to feed yourself. If you have children, you have to feed them. You got to buy clothes. You got to do stuff. Like, you need money. Here's the thing. Even if you are, quote unquote, doing it legally, you're in the asylum process, you're waiting for your court date, legally speaking, you have to wait 180 days to apply for a work permit. Now, that is to apply for a work permit. That is not to say that that is when you're going to be granted a work permit. That is completely up in the air. I mean, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, a year, who the fuck knows at this point? And one can make the argument, if you're being charitable, that is because there is a backlog. If one wanted to be uncharitable, you could say it's because the government is slow-walking these sorts of things lately. But that's another situation where people, I don't think, understand the situation that asylum seekers are in that, obviously, like I said, you have to work, like, one has to make money in order to survive, but they're being put in a situation where they can't legally go get a job. So what the hell are you supposed to do? Well, you do one of two things. Either you work under the table and you take whatever you can get, and I mean, there is exploitation that happens, let's keep it real. Or you buy a social security number and you find an employer who may not be super duper finicky about whether you are actually a legal, like, resident of the United States. Or even, I mean, people point to E-Verify, and E-Verify is such a fucking joke. Like, their success rate with actually identifying illegal immigrants working is like, it's in like the 20 percentile range. It's like, it's stupid. Like, the whole program is just stupid. But that's the situation that these people are in. So, I mean, like, what else do you want them to do? Like, it's a situation and it's a system that's rigged to basically fuck with people. And this is one where everybody wants to complain about immigrants coming here and mooching off the system, which, to be sure, let me make another thing clear. It is extremely limited, the amounts of things that you can get legally if you are an immigrant in the United States. Like, you are not eligible for pretty much anything outside of sending your kids to school and going to the ER. Like, everything else is verboten to you. Although, if you do work and you do pay taxes, you're expected to pay into these systems, and you will never see that money again. Which is kind of fucked up, if you think about it. That an immigrant is working and paying into Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and all of these other government systems, but they will never have access to them. So, think about that for a second. But, moving on to the current border living situations. Now, a lot of people have made arguments, and again, I am trying to keep this factual and not get into my opinions on certain things, but I have seen people kind of throw up their hands and say, well, what else do you want them to do? All of these people are coming here. What do you want us to do with them? Like, oh my God, what else? We have to put them in these holding places. We have to put them in detention centers because what else are we going to do with them? First of all, completely ignoring the fact that we didn't always have these detention centers. It's a relatively new thing. Yes, it existed under Obama, but yes, it is being exploited under Trump. But I want to point out an Obama-era plan that, to be sure, it was a pilot plan, but I feel like this plan could have a lot of promise if it was implemented. And that is the Family Case Management Program. Now, like I said, this was a pilot program. I believe they tried it out in about 3 cities. And it was through ICE. And basically, how this was handled was that, okay, an asylum seeker, they go through their credible fear interview, and if they met certain criteria in their credible fear interview, they were released to family members or somebody who was willing to vouch for them, and then they were assigned a caseworker. And what the caseworker did was probably a lot of what an immigration lawyer does as far as helping people through the asylum process. Not that the caseworkers were immigration lawyers, but basically the caseworker's job was to explain the process to the asylum seeker, to give them any kind of assistance that they might need, to make sure that they show up to their court dates, and to basically guide the asylum seekers through the asylum seeking process. And it had a very, very, very high success rate. And that, I think, would be if you wanted to stay within this framework of the asylum seeking process as it stands now and try to offer an alternative to it, I think that actually sounds like a fairly decent plan. Because, first off, when you're releasing asylum seekers to people who are vouching for them, obviously you're releasing them from government care, which means the government isn't responsible for feeding them, housing them, doing anything else for them. There's someone else's responsibility on that level. And then, second of all, you're providing them with the resources and tools that they need to make it through the asylum process. I don't know. It really seems like a much more humane way of handling things versus what is going on right now. And again, like I said, I'm going to try to keep from opining on that situation because, of course, I have given my opinions on this many, many, many times. But yeah, there's different and better ways of handling this situation other than how it is currently being handled on the border right now. Like, this shit's insane. It's atrocious. Like, it does not need to be this way. Anyway, moving on. Because there's one last topic we need to talk about before I leave off on this episode, and that is immigration court itself. Immigration court is not really like any other court system in the United States, or at least not one that your typical U.S. citizen would interact with. It is not part of the criminal court system. Let me make that clear. It is not part of the criminal court system. So, by default, it is part of the civil court system, but it's kind of not part of that either. It's neither beast nor fowl. It's this really weird, almost outside of the judicial system place that is, if a U.S. citizen were to be subjected to what people are subjected to in immigration court, there would probably be riots. But let me try to explain how this works. And it's, like I said, it's not criminal, it's kind of not civil. The first thing to understand is that in immigration court, immigrants are not given the kind of option, well, not even option. Like, okay, obviously when you are a U.S. citizen and you're going to criminal court, you are entitled to a lawyer. Whether you can afford one or not, one will be appointed to you. We all know how Miranda works. That is not how immigration court works. If an immigrant cannot afford their own private legal representation, they don't get legal representation. Like, that's it. Like, you either hire a lawyer, which costs money, obviously, sometimes a lot of fucking money, or you have no legal representation at all, which you don't. I don't even understand how you would begin to try to make it through this process without legal representation. But there's that. The second thing to understand is that immigration judges are not judges the way U.S. citizens typically think of judges. Like, normally in the criminal or civil court systems, you either have judges that, depending on where you live, what circuit you're dealing with, whatever, you either have judges that are elected or judges that are appointed and are vetted and verified and voted on in that way. Immigration court is comprised of immigration judges that are directly appointed by the Attorney General of the United States. There is no vetting, there is no, like, voting, there is no process like that. Like, they're just appointed by the Attorney General. And so, obviously, depending on the situation that is going on in the United States, at the particular time that an immigration judge is appointed by the Attorney General, is likely going to determine the temperament of the judge appointed by the Attorney General. Which is to say, this is obviously a somewhat biased system, depending on the Attorney General at the time. Second thing to understand. There are roughly 400 immigration judges in the United States, which sounds like a lot of judges, until you stop to think about how many people the immigration courts need to process in order to even attempt to try to have some kind of fig leaf of due process for immigrants, which, by the way, that's also not a thing that they're entitled to. There's no legal entitlement to due process. These things can take it however long they take, and there's really no legal recourse. But you've got, like I said, roughly 400 judges, and each judge has about as of this recording, and like I said, this is all always subject to change, and this is another thing that the Trump administration has been trying to fuck with, is the amount of immigration judges. Like, they're trying to cut the amount of immigration judges, don't call them justices, that's not right, but they're trying to cut the amount of judges who can hear these cases. But even as it stands, like, each judge has about 1,000 case workload, which is absolutely fucking insane. Like, there is no other judge in any other court in this country that would even remotely entertain the idea of having that many cases on their docket. But that, it is what it is. Like, this is what they have to work with. So, you have that. And it's just, it's a weird system that you really kind of need to, like, see it to understand it, but it's not anything analogous to what a U.S. citizen would consider to be a legitimate court hearing. Like, it's kind of, it's nutty, it's crazy, and it's starting to get even more nutty and crazy, because another thing to understand before I make my last point, it almost feels stupid to even have to say this, but just to illustrate how different immigration court is. And by the way, this is all controlled by DOJ and the executive branch, which is another thing that is completely different about immigration court other than other courts. So, various people just had to sue the federal government, and fortunately won this lawsuit, to assure that asylum seekers who are in custody, by the way, people who have not violated any law, but are in custody, can bond out and be free. This was a lawsuit that had to happen, because This was a thing that wasn't happening. Like, asylum seekers were being held indefinitely without bond and didn't even fucking commit a crime. Okay. Anyway, yes, that is a thing. And that is how weird and just kind of outside our normal judicial system that immigration court is. And the second thing, and the last point that I want to make before I leave out of this episode, is what is planning to happen. And that is, and hear me out, I am not making this up. Basically, the idea is that tents will be set up and there will be mass asylum hearings, but stay with me here. The judge will not be in the tent. The judge will be somewhere in their courthouse, wherever that happens to physically be located. And the asylum seekers, as the plan stands right now, would not be able to have their lawyers actually physically present with them in the tent. Like, the lawyers will have to be at whatever courthouse the judge is at. Can you imagine any U.S. citizen being subjected to that kind of legal process and there not be just like riots in the fucking streets? Like this, it's so, like, this is not, no. When one is promised their day in court, you imagine, first of all, you're gonna be in freaking court in front of an actual real life judge, and if you have legal counsel, they will be there in the room with you. Like, that's just, oh my god. It's just, it's so fucked up and bizarre how this situation is working out right now. And I'm sure it will get worse. I'm sure. Because there is no incentive for it to get better. And the cruelty is the point. And I think that is where I will leave off on this, because we have already gone insanely long on this episode. But I wanted to try to explain some of this stuff to you so that, like I said, maybe you can have a better understanding of what it is that's going on and why some of us get so torqued about this stuff and just how nuts it is and just how really honestly unfair and just crazy this really is. So at this point, as always, if you did make it this far, thank you. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. Take care, and until next time.